Let's talk about the moment power met resistance. When a figure like Donald Trump gets called out not by a rival in his own party, not by a news anchor, but by a sovereign nation like India, the room shifts. The world pays attention. This isn't about ego anymore. It's about standing. India didn't whisper. India didn't send a back-channel message. India stood tall, looked across the diplomatic aisle, and said, "No, we will not have this." That takes nerve. That takes leverage, and more than anything, it signals a change in how the world reacts to American political figures post-office, especially those with reputations that cast long, controversial shadows. Now, Trump, we know, isn't a man who walks quietly. He builds his image around dominance, disruption, and defiance. But when that energy is met with equal resistance from a nation not just rising, but already risen, you witness something bigger than headlines. You witness a geopolitical statement. For India to openly challenge or correct Trump, it wasn't about playing politics. It was about drawing a line, not just in the sand, but in the narrative. And when a country does that, it's not reacting, it's repositioning itself. But the world doesn't spin with just one voice. While India was calling Trump out, another figure, equally powerful though far more reserved, stood in the background. General Asim Munir, chief of Pakistan's army. A man not known for Twitter wars, not known for spectacle, but for silent, strategic movement. And that silence becomes the center of curiosity. Did he respond? Did he reach out in condolence, in caution, or in calculated quiet? Now, let's not pretend geopolitics is ever simple. A message of condolence might look like compassion on paper, but on the global chessboard, it's a signal. If Asim Munir condoles Trump, what does that say to India? To the United States, to the world watching the shifting alliances of South Asia? Every word from a figure like him, or every absence of one, means something. And that's where the drama deepens. See, Trump being called out by India sets a precedent that the old rules, where former American leaders could comment freely about global players without real pushback, are fading. In this new order, accountability isn't reserved just for current presidents. It follows influence, and when influence crosses borders, so do consequences. Asim Munir's potential reaction, or his refusal to engage, becomes a story of its own. A man leading one of the most powerful militaries in the region knows the weight of perception. A condolence, if it happened, could be read as an alignment. A silence, if it was held, might speak volumes about restraint or quiet resistance. Either way, it's power, unspoken, yet unmistakable. This triangle Trump, India, and Munir isn't just a collision of names. It's the outline of where the new world order is drifting. Bold voices, quiet generals, and a former U.S. president caught between. Not every leader needs to raise his voice to change the tone of the room. Sometimes the most commanding presence is the one who chooses when not to speak. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what Asim Munir did. Trump's reputation has always walked into the room before he does loud, unapologetic, unpredictable. He built a legacy, or at least a brand, on breaking protocol, on throwing elbows in the diplomatic arena. But in this latest chapter, that bravado met a brick wall. Because this time, the response didn't come from some Washington critic or a late night anchor. It came from India, and not with ambiguity, it came with clarity. A public call-out, a firm stance, a declaration that even a former president of the United States doesn't get a free pass when it comes to the dignity and sovereignty of another nation. That kind of response doesn't come from impulse. It comes from confidence. India, for decades viewed through the lens of emerging potential, has now stepped into the frame as a global player. And when a nation stands up and checks a former U.S. leader, it sends a message not just to that individual, but to the whole international order. It says, we're not going to let political theater undermine national pride. This wasn't a show of defiance. It was a calculated reminder that power, in this new era, is more distributed than it used to be. It no longer flows from the west outward. It pulses across the globe from New Delhi to Islamabad, from Beijing to Washington. And that ripple effect, it doesn't stop with the people making the noise. It reaches the ones who stay silent, the ones who play the long game. That brings us to Asim Munir, a man of very few public words, yet many quiet actions. While Trump was being challenged by India, all eyes turned not openly, but internally to Pakistan's corridors of power. People asked, what will General Munir do? Will he speak? Will he condole? Will he step into the chaos or stay in the shadows? You see, that's the paradox of real leadership. When you don't speak, the world starts speaking for you. And when you do speak even a whisper, it echoes louder than the loudest critic. That's the position Munir holds. If he had issued a condolence, it wouldn't just be a humanitarian gesture. It would have been interpreted as a political signal, a nod to a certain alignment, a subtle brushstroke on a regional canvas already soaked in tension. But if he chose not to, if there was no condolence, no commentary, just strategic silence, that too becomes part of the narrative. Because in geopolitics, not responding is still a response, especially from a man who knows the weight of his words. A military chief from Pakistan doesn't move lightly on matters involving India, the U.S., or figures like Donald Trump, because every action, every pause, reshapes perception. And perception is half the battlefield. That's why this moment, small on the surface, is big underneath. It's not about whether Trump deserves a response. It's about who chooses to engage and what that engagement costs diplomatically, symbolically, regionally. India took a stand, loud and clear, and Asim Munir, he may have taken a position just as strong by saying nothing at all, because sometimes the most deliberate choice a leader makes is the one to not speak when the world expects it most. There's something to be said about the power of a man who doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard. While the world turned its ears toward India's public challenge to Donald Trump, sharp, clear, undeniable, another player entered the frame, not through noise, but through silence. General Asim Munir, the chief of Pakistan's army, a name not tossed around in media for sound bites or scandals, but one that carries weight in boardrooms, strategy circles, and among the world's quiet decision makers. And when a man like that is pulled into a conversation, whether by action or omission, people pay attention. Because here's the truth, when Trump gets called out by India, the reverberation doesn't stop at U.S. or Indian borders. It sweeps across the region, it crosses into Islamabad, into GHQ, where Pakistan's military brass watch every diplomatic shift like a chess grandmaster reads a board. The question that rose wasn't just what India said or how Trump would clap back. It became, what is Asim Munir going to do? Will he condole? Will he acknowledge? Will he insert himself into the friction? Or will he stay still and make silence speak for him? Now, understand the context. This is not just about diplomacy. It's about decoding intentions. When a top military leader from a rival state extends even a polite gesture toward someone called out by your adversary, that's not just empathy, that's messaging. A condolence from Munir to Trump, if it happened, would have been read by many in India as a subtle jab, a counterbalance, maybe even a symbolic alignment. One small statement could tilt conversations, could fuel headlines, could light fires in places that already carry dry wood and old grievances. And that's the risk and the genius in restraint. Because when Munir says nothing, he doesn't just avoid the fallout. He forces everyone else to ask why, to analyze, to speculate. Was it deliberate silence? Was it a refusal to legitimize the moment? Was it a message that Pakistan doesn't see Trump as a figure worthy of that kind of recognition anymore? Or was it simply strategic, a move to let India burn bright in the spotlight, while Pakistan watches from the shadows, calculating its next step? This isn't the first time silence has been used as a diplomatic weapon. But in a region as sensitive, as reactive, as South Asia, silence can be louder than a speech. And when it comes from a man like Asim Munir, known more for internal discipline than public drama, it carries even more gravity. Because, in a world of quick reactions and loud commentary, he chooses to play the long game. And in the long game, it's not about who speaks first. It's about who speaks last and who makes it count. The balance of power in this region isn't just built on tanks or treaties. It's built on perception, on posture. And right now, Munir's posture says everything without needing to say a word. Whether he condoles Trump or not is beside the point. What matters is how carefully that decision either way is being read, watched, and weighed by those who understand the deeper language of geopolitics. And in that quiet space between words, real influence lies. In the game of global power, words are never just words. They're signals, strategies, and sometimes weapons. That's why this moment, this question, did Asim Munir condole Donald Trump, carries more weight than it seems, because it isn't just about sympathy or about diplomacy. It's about reading the room, reading the silence, understanding what's being said or left unsaid when leaders play for more than headlines. When a figure like General Asim Munir makes a move or doesn't, the world leans in. Now think about what a condolence actually means in this context. On the surface, it's a soft gesture, a simple message of empathy, but in the undercurrent of international politics, it can be something entirely different. If Munir had indeed expressed condolences toward Trump after India publicly called him out, that would have been read and interpreted far beyond the gesture itself. It could be seen as an alignment, a subtle reinforcement of Trump's position, or even a quiet pushback against India's stance. That's the reality of strategic diplomacy. It's not about what's written on the page, it's about what's between the lines. So, if a condolence did happen, we have to ask, was it sympathy, or was it strategy? Because in regions like South Asia, nothing comes without calculation. Every statement is weighed against not just international optics, but regional consequences. For Pakistan, and especially for someone like Asim Munir, there is no room for gestures that don't carry intention. So whether the condolence was offered or not, the decision itself was part of a larger calculation. And that's the power play many people miss. Look closely, because sometimes what looks like a gesture of kindness could be a deliberate signal, a way of saying, we see what you're doing and we're not standing behind it. Or perhaps even, we're keeping our options open. If it was offered, that condolence might not have been about Trump at all. It might have been about regional posture, about keeping India on its toes, about reminding the world that Pakistan's military leadership doesn't just watch, it responds, sometimes in ways only the careful observers catch. But on the flip side, if that condolence wasn't made, that silence becomes even more intriguing. Because silence in the world of statecraft is never empty. It holds its own message. It can say, we're not engaging with you. Or we see your fall, and we're not lifting a finger. And that kind of restraint, cold, calculated, quiet, is a power move in itself. It tells Trump, India, and anyone watching that Pakistan's top general isn't going to be baited into emotional responses, that he understands the value of holding the line, of letting others make noise while he watches from the high ground. And if we look at Munir's track record, this fits. He's not a man who makes political statements through interviews or tweets. His influence is exercised through control, through silence, through timing. A condolence in his hands would not be casual, it would be deliberate. And that's why the whole world, even if silently, wonders what exactly he did in this moment. Because that's the power of someone like Asim Munir. Whether he speaks or stays silent, people listen, because in geopolitics, a whisper from the right man can shake more ground than a shout from the wrong one. In this world of shifting alliances and evolving power centers, no move goes unnoticed. When India called out Donald Trump, it wasn't just a matter of setting the record straight. It was a show of strength, a declaration that it's no longer playing defense in the global dialogue. India stood its ground, fired back publicly, and in doing so, reminded the world that it's not a background character in global affairs. It's a lead. But while that drama played out on the main stage, something just as significant was unfolding quietly backstage, in a very different kind of room, with a very different kind of energy. Pakistan watching closely. And at the center of that watch, General Asim Munir. Now, this wasn't Munir's battle, not directly, but in the geopolitical dance of South Asia. No skirmish involving India happens without Pakistan paying attention. That's just the reality of the region. What India does, Pakistan assesses. What India says, Pakistan hears twice, once in public and again in private, with deeper ears. So when Trump finds himself under fire from India, the real question isn't just how the U.S. media reacts, or even what Trump himself says next. It's what Pakistan sees in that moment, and more importantly, what it chooses to do with it. This is where the story becomes less about Trump and more about how power shifts quietly across borders. Because when one giant rises, India in this case, other one doesn't necessarily fall, but it recalibrates. Pakistan doesn't have to respond to India's words with equal volume. It doesn't need to issue a press release. What it needs to do is reposition, rethink, reassert its place in the balance. And that kind of adjustment isn't made by diplomats at press podiums. It's made in military strategy meetings, intelligence briefings, and closed-door policy shifts. That's where Asim Munir operates. And here's what makes Munir so critical in this moment. He understands the game beyond the headlines. While India's rebuke of Trump may seem like a one-off event, it actually signals something larger, the growing confidence of a regional power. And when a neighbor becomes more vocal, more visible, and more aggressive in international forums, the balance of power starts to shift. Munir sees that, he reads it, and he starts planning not for today, but for what comes next. Did he respond publicly to Trump's fallout? Maybe not, but he didn't have to, because his role isn't just to comment, it's to act when it matters. And sometimes the most effective action is patience. Observation, a recalibrated posture that prepares for the next move, because in South Asia, strength isn't always measured in the moment. It's measured in the aftermath. What this moment between India and Trump really reveals is that power in the region is being renegotiated in real time. It's no longer about who shouts loudest. It's about who adapts fastest. India's boldness was a move. Pakistan's stillness, that might be its counter. And General Munir, known for his strategic calm, understands that you don't always challenge noise with noise. Sometimes you answer it with silence, and follow it with action later, when the world's no longer looking, but when the consequences matter most. Because in this region, nothing stands still for long. And while India makes noise, Pakistan is listening. And while Trump stirs controversy, Munir is calculating. That's the real balance of power. One loud, one quiet, both watching, both ready. There's a certain truth that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. Power respects power. And in this moment, when Donald Trump found himself publicly called out by India, it wasn't just a jab at a former U.S. president. It was a recalibration of respect, a reset of the equation. India wasn't playing second fiddle. It took the microphone, raised its voice, and demanded to be heard. But what happened in that space after the call-out is where the real game began. Not in the headlines, not in Trump's rebuttals or silence, but in how the rest of the world read the moment. And that brings us once again to General Asim Munir. This situation wasn't just about a comment made by Trump or the reply from India. It was about where the pieces would fall after the dust settled. In South Asia, perception is a weapon, and no one knows how to manage perception quite like Asim Munir. The man is a strategist by design, trained to understand not just military movements, but public ones, political ones, international ones. So when India made a loud move on the global stage, he understood that the best response wasn't necessarily to clap back, but to recalculate, to evaluate the new terrain. What does that terrain look like now? India, emboldened, asserting not just economic strength, but diplomatic independence. Trump, bruised, but not irrelevant, still capable of igniting reactions across the globe. And Pakistan under Asim Munir's steady hand, measuring every reaction, every implication, every shift in narrative. That's the key here, because the real power doesn't come from reacting to what's loud. It comes from shaping what comes next. And that's where Munir's genius lies, in the aftermath, in the control of pace. India moved fast. Trump sparked controversy. The media jumped on it. But Munir, he waited. He understood that sometimes the best way to reassert control is to let others exhaust themselves first. Then you enter. Then you decide whether to engage, to pivot, or to observe longer. That's not indecision. That's deliberate pacing. If Munir had come out with a statement, if he had issued a condolence or rebuke or support, it would have added fuel to a fire that didn't need it. Instead, by doing nothing outwardly, he shifted the conversation inward, made the world ask questions, made India wonder, made Trump's team speculate, and in that space where uncertainty lives is where control quietly shifts. Because when you don't show your next move, you own the board. That's the lesson here, not just for Trump, not just for India, but for every observer who thinks power is always loud. It's not. Real power knows when to speak, and when to let others talk themselves into a corner, when to hold steady and let the narrative fold in on itself, when to let silence be its own language. That's what Munir did. Whether he condoned or condemned Trump didn't matter as much as how he managed the moment. And he managed it like a man who's been in this game far longer than most realize. So while the noise fades and headlines shift, one thing remains. Munir didn't just react. He recalibrated. And in the quiet aftermath, that's what true command looks like.